the mic. Glad I checked. Okay. Let's check also here. That. Perfect. Okay. So yeah, the intro day from Tuesday will be up on Blackboard, so you can check that if you need to. Which again, that was just going over the basic syllabus stuff, which should also be up on Blackboard for you guys. Let me think. I can think of anything else before we get started. Any questions from you guys? Any clarification? All set? Okay. So, welcome to Exploring American History. Let's actually get into the material. Let's see. Chapter 1 is Mapping Global Frontiers, which is from about as far back as we've got evidence of human existence in North America to about 1585. So we're going to be covering a lot of ground in a short period of time. So we have evidence of humans crossing from Northeast Asia about 16,000 to 14,000 BCE, although there is recent evidence of humans having arrived in North and South America as far back as 40,000 years ago, but then that group dying out, and the group that became the Native Americans today were the ones that crossed the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, known as Beringia, because back then this was during the Ice Age, and because of, well, all the ice, the sea levels were lower, and, well, again, there was a lot more ice, so they were able to just walk from Siberia to Alaska. A lot of that was following herds of their prey, mammoth, musk oxen, woolly rhinoceros, etc. The land bridge itself was known as Beringia. The modern-day Bering Straits wasn't there, obviously. Now, as these groups spread throughout North America, they began settling down in different regions. Some settled down along the coast, others made their way inland or further south along the coast using little boats to find more game, because about 10,000 years ago, mammoths and these other large game had largely gone extinct. Yes? I will put the chapter PowerPoint up once we finish each chapter, so you can go back and review it. Yes? Right, yeah. You can take notes as we go, but once we're done, I'll put it up on Blackboard so you can review it. Yeah, so by about 10,000 years ago, mammoths and the other large megafauna had largely gone extinct. There is apparently an island north of Siberia where some mammoth had made their way to and survived until about 4,000 years ago, until humans arrived there and wiped them out. So go us, we're really good at making things go extinct. So it took until about 3,000 years ago that these groups eventually settled down into communities, most of the time because they had been nomadic, which, again, just going back to my European history, is how human civilizations start. They began nomadic and follow groups of game until eventually they settled down into relatively stable societies. Now, of course, if they're settling down, they're going to have agriculture, or at least starting out horticulture, which is a more a bit more primitive form of agriculture. Small plots of land, simple tools. But of course, if you're settling down, you need to build structures to live in, some level of shelter, defenses against not just the wild animals that want to eat you, but also the other groups of humans that are out there, because humans are the worst. So yeah, this was the beginning of civilizations in North America. So here we have Beringia. Again, this is just the modern day Bering Strait, but the water level was lower, and all that was iced over. So you could literally just walk it. It wasn't an easy walk, obviously, but if you're following, the herds of animals that you depend upon to survive, it doesn't matter where you're going. They had no. I very highly doubt they knew that they were like going into another entire region of the world. I think this was the island that I mentioned earlier where mammoths ended up, because when the sea levels rose again, they were cut off until humans made their way up there later anyway and ruined things. And in case you don't know what they look like, there's a woolly rhinoceros. It's a rhinoceros, but hairy. Also larger. These, obviously, Ice Age megafauna were huge, hence the name. And then, of course, the mammoth. And while it's very difficult to have, like, ruins from this time period, we do have, like, archaeological evidence of these sorts of settlements where they would build all the living I guess you'd say living quarters in the middle, and then around that settlement you would have the fields and whatnot. Because obviously, while the little grass huts don't survive to the modern day, we do have like the indentations where they would dig in the ground for like fire pits, various tools that survived, that sort of thing. All right. So when we talk about the main civilizations in North America prior to the Europeans showing up and throwing a wrench into things, we're of course going to talk about the Aztecs, Mayas, and Incas, because they were massive civilizations prior to contact with the Europeans. So, by the early 16th century, which is the 1500s, we had the Aztec and Maya in the equatorial region of North America, which is to say like Mexico and Central America, thereabouts. And then the Inca, which were along like most of the western coastline of South America, which is to say modern-day Peru. So the Aztecs, who call themselves the Mexica, hence why the country is known as Mexico, had built their capital, which I had tried to learn to pronounce, Tenochtitlan, I think, where present-day Mexico City is. We'll get to that a little bit later as to why that's the case, which is kind of on a lake, which, again, I'll get more into when we get to a map. Now, the Aztecs themselves were still sort of semi-nomadic. They moved around a lot, but they still did build these really impressive structures, which we still have examples of today. And they were very warlike. They would conquer other tribes and take their people and absorb them into the tribe. But also, when they conquered other people, they would absorb their knowledge into the tribe. They wouldn't just wipe everything out and move on. They would learn irrigation, cultivation, written language, etc. from these various groups, and made their empire that much stronger. Unfortunately, a lot of this written language has been destroyed thanks to, once again, the conquistadors, so we actually have very little record written by the Aztecs that has survived. As far as the Mayas, they were a little bit further south along the Yucatan Peninsula, which again, like modern-day Guatemala, Central America. Between about 900 BCE and 300 CE, which is a good little chunk of time, about 1,000 years. Um, However, around 800 CE, they started to decline. The empire itself fell apart, and by the 16th century, they had kind of reemerged as these little city-states, which, if you're not familiar with that term, it's what it sounds like. Each city is its own independent state, and not like we have here in the United States, like literally their own little nation. They shared a like the Mayan culture, but there was no overall Mayan government as we understand it. It was just each city did its own thing. They were trading with the Aztecs, so they still existed. They just were not nearly as powerful as they had once been, and certainly not as powerful as the Aztecs and the Inca, which is why when we get into, once again, the conquistadors, the Maya aren't really mentioned too much. They just sort of fell apart with everybody else. Speaking of the Inca, down in South America, they were also like the Aztecs, where they were very warlike. They would conquer other tribes and then use the knowledge and hard work of these tribes to make themselves more powerful. They lived largely in the Andes Mountains, with their capital, Cusco, right in the middle in these fertile mountain valleys. So, I mean, if you've ever, I'll show you pictures in that. I was gonna say, if you've ever seen like anything with the Incan ruins, it's very, very green. Is the only way I could describe it. It's just, even today, after everything that's happened over these centuries, it's still just really, really fertile land. Highly advanced. They had roads, cities, intricate temples. They also, and I mean all three of these, were quite adept at like astronomy. They were aware of like the phases of the moon and the stars, and even like lunar eclipses and solar eclipses and all that stuff. So yeah, they were very advanced. So here we have the Aztec Empire. Yeah, like I said, it was on the river there. Sorry, the lake. Lake Texcoco. Texcoco. And if I remember right, I think this was the lake, unless it was this one over here. But there's a big lake in Mexico where during the time of the Aztecs, they would offer sacrifices. And by that I mean they would chuck gold into the lake, because as we'll see through a lot of the conquistadors going forward, there was a lot of gold in Mexico. And it got to the point that for the Aztecs, like, yeah, I mean, it was still shiny gold, and you could easily mold it so it was very valuable. But they were still just like, okay, well, we're going to have our festival for this god, and to sacrifice to the god, we're going to take this statue that we made and we're going to toss it in the lake to sacrifice it to whatever gods they were sacrificing it to. So the Spanish found out about this after they arrived in North America, and did their best to go down in the lake and get this gold back out, because they're greedy. However, the lake was very treacherous. It's one of those lakes where it's deeper than it looks, and the bottom is very silty. So as soon as you get near the bottom, the visibility goes to zero. You can't see anything. And a lot of them drowned. And so a good like 200 years later, Mexico's independent. They've got their own government. This was like in the 1800s, so they had like steam power by this point. They decided they were going to drain part of the lake and try to get some of this gold out, because, I mean, gold's still valuable. It still ended up killing a lot of them. So don't mess with other people's gold, apparently, is the lesson here. So here is one of their cities. Obviously today we see the ruins and it's just like bleached stone, but a lot of the images that we have from the contemporary time, it was all painted very brightly, which is actually similar to like the ancient Greek and Roman stuff. Today you see it's just like plain white marble. That's not what the statues look like. They were painted. They were actually kind of gaudy. But the paint that they used was, what's the name? What was the type of paint? Not fresco, that's the style. I don't remember exactly the type, but it uses egg whites as like the bonding agent. So it's really easy to use. It's also less dangerous than oil paint because it won't just like straight up murder you. But it has to be reapplied every so often because it will just flake and fall off because it's organic. It's made out of egg whites. So once these civilizations were essentially destroyed, no one was around to reapply the paint. So now today when we see when you have the ruins, it's just bare stone. But it used to be not just these big stone structures, but also very colorful. So I thought that was kind of neat. And I also bring up when I show this image, whoever is the groundskeeper here has got to be making crazy money because not only is this a lot of land, and it's going to be hot because they're on the freaking equator, they're in the middle of the jungle. Like, you can almost watch the plants growing. They move they grow so fast, and yet they're able to keep the jungle back away from these ruins, which isn't easy. Which is why, like, even literally today, in the modern, like, last couple of years, they're still finding these things out in the jungle because the jungle just overgrows stuff and it becomes essentially impenetrable. And you can just like be walking through the jungle and all of a sudden end up on the steps of one of these things. All right, let's see. So moving down to the Aztecs, the Toltecs were a group that were, I said not the Aztecs, the Maya over here. The Toltecs were a group that were like early rivals to the Aztecs, as you can see, considering they were centered around where the Aztecs put their capital. But they're not ever mentioned in the book, so we're not going to worry about them. But by the way, that was something that happened early in their history. So anyway, the Aztecs over here, where's my mouse? There we go. Aztecs over here, Maya over here on the Yucatan Peninsula, which again is just so much jungle. Yeah. Similar step pyramids, similar style. Obviously, again, for people who are archaeologists, like they could, tell you at a glance not only the difference in the two, but like probably what era they were built in. But that's not my specialty. I'm just here to show you guys what those look like. And then, of course, the Inca, which were just, like I said, basically down almost the entire coast of South America, which is mostly mountains. You've got the Andes Mountains all the way down the coast of South America, which has incredibly fertile soil. This is one of the, this is, I lost the name. This is a particular, particularly famous ruin in the mountains. And yeah, obviously it's a tourist attraction because again, it's being kept pretty well maintained so people don't just get lost in the jungle. But it's way up in the mountains. All right. So moving north out of, Mexico and South America, we have the Mogollon potters and Hohokam irrigators that were making civilizations less advanced than the Aztecs and Mayas, but still, I mean, imagine being like the first person to invent a clay pot. Like, that's a pretty big deal. You have somewhere to put stuff now. And irrigation is a civilization-defining technology. Like, that's a big deal. All right. Further north than that, which again we're still talking about like the American Southwest, around 750 CE, the Pueblos started their construction of these large masonry houses cut into the cliff. If you are unfamiliar with the Pueblo, you will know what I'm talking about when I show you these images. If you've ever seen anything about the West, you've seen the Pueblo houses. They're largely built around a sunken ceremonial room known as the kiva. They did move further south and constructed freestanding homes, but eventually they moved back because of a drought that forced them away from these newer civilizations. And I don't know, again, the book doesn't really go super into that, so I'm just not going to worry about it. And again, the Pueblo are most well known for their cliff houses, and by the time the Europeans get there, they're back in their cliff houses, so we're not going to worry too much about the freestanding buildings thing. Further north, there were tribes that lived in the plains. They were typically still nomadic and would follow herds of bison. And by the way, now I've been told that this has been disputed, but I am still of the opinion that horses didn't exist in North America, at least not concurrently with Native Americans. There were like ancient horses that died out along with, mammoths and bison and whatnot. So these natives hunting bison on the plains were on foot. They had to like sneak through the brush with this atlatl, which is, I'll show you in a bit what it looks like, but it's basically this this device that helped them throw a spear harder so that they could hopefully kill the bison in one hit, because if you piss off a bison, it's going to kill you. Bison are huge. Think of the biggest cow you've ever seen and double that. That's a bison. They're huge. I was in Yellowstone as a child, and I was standing beside a parked car, and a bison walked out the other side, and I swear its shoulder was that high. They are large animals. We also had the Chumash tribe that settled down along the Pacific coast. They largely used hunting and gathering, but also did a lot of fishing. Now, their source of fishing was not just, like a rod and a line, but they would build these like fish traps, which were essentially baskets that had like pointed reeds facing inward, so the fish would swim into the basket, and then when they tried to swim back out, they would run into the little spiky bits and not be able to swim back out. And they would just place that down in a river and let the fish swim in. And this actually works so well. I don't remember if this is the book that mentions it or if I'm thinking about a previous, because I've used multiple books for this class at this point. No, it's a different one. Anyway, this works so well that there is actually no record of the Chumash ever actually having a famine. Like, there were, of course, times when the animals they were hunting left, or the food that they were gathering dried up or wasn't around because of droughts or whatever. But the fish never went away because they weren't a large enough group to overfish like we have today. So yeah, they actually had an extremely stable society because they were fishing. Meanwhile, we have the Hopewell, which the book gives us a little bit on, but I had kind of misunderstood. So, the Hopewell were not a tribe. They were a collection of multiple groups who would trade among one another. They had a sort of shared culture. Again, they had their own separate, distinct cultures up and down the Mississippi. And when I say here they number between 4,000 to 6,000 people, that was like per village, and that was massive back then to have that many people in a single village. They had these huge burial mounds, sculpted earthworks, etc. We still have some left today, but like about 5% of what used to be out there, because when America started moving west, we just bulldozed the hell out of them. And a lot of them were full of bones, and we just dumped them in a river because, 1800s America. But we'll get to that later. So, these are the Pueblo houses. The houses literally cut into the cliff. This is, to me, a better image because it shows the whole cliff face. You've probably seen this. So if you've seen anything about the West, I imagine you've seen something about these Pueblo houses. They're built out of, they're cut into the cliffs, but they're also like made out of like mud and brick, because again, literally out there, you can take the mud and form it into a brick and like leave it out in the sun, and it essentially becomes hard as like a brick we use today in building. Like these weren't just little mud houses. They were, as you can see, they're still around. These aren't modern Pueblo houses. They're just still around. And then you have the groups that were out on the plains, which again were more nomadic. Their housing, the teepees, were very mobile. You could just pick them up and move them to wherever you were going. This is the atlatl, which is essentially a stick with like a bit of twine that you used they used these are like a little catapult, essentially. It was, what's the physics term? Like the lever, yeah. It's essentially made the arm longer because of the way that it worked, so you could throw the spear harder. And again, when you're going after something that is as big as a bison, you need every advantage you can get. Along the coastline, you also, besides the Chumash who would fish, you also had groups a bit further north who would hunt whales. So a lot of their houses would use whalebone as structural support. Just like way back before, a lot of the homes would use like mammoth bone as structural support because you had these big ass bones. So this is, the Chumash region just in like southern modern day California, which is just lots of rivers, as you can see, and since the mountains are right there, that's where the salmon are going. So you just put the little fish basket down in the river and let the salmon do their thing, and you've got a bunch of fish. All right, so here are a number of the ceremonial earthworks that remain. As you can see, a lot of them are partially buried. We're using like ground penetrating radar to really see them in their full view. There are some that are close enough to the ground or close enough to the surface that you can actually see them. And it's difficult, unfortunately, to maintain them because they're not big stone structures. They're earthworks. But when you see them from a distance like this, the Octagon in Newark, this is like, this is miles of structure here. This isn't just like some piles of dirt. These are huge. Again, I mentioned this when I talked about this last year. There is a YouTuber who is mostly an archaeologist, which I guess technically this would be archaeology, and he has, I think, 2 separate videos now on the Hopewell Earthworks, Mini Minuteman, if you've ever seen his stuff. A lot of his more viral stuff is just him like shitting on weird conspiracy theorists, which is always funny. But he has like gone to the Hopewell Earthworks and done some really good research on it. So if you're interested in this, give it a watch. It's pretty good. All right. And again, the Hopewell, it says here interaction sphere, because again, they weren't a single group of people. But you have all these different groups that interacted largely because they connected through the Mississippi River. This was the Hopewell shared, again, you can't really say shared culture because they had separate cultures, but it was the shared, I guess, commerce, really. And as you can see, I mean, it goes from way up in Canada, both in the west and the east, all the way down to Texas and even like the coast of Florida and Georgia. So like just massive all the way down. All right. Now, over to Europe and what's going on over there, because as I said on Tuesday about how we can't just ignore previous patterns of history. Let's ignore the previous like several thousand years and skip to the 1500s. So Europe in the 1500s, there's a lot going on. You've got the Crusades happening because you've got Islam in like northern Africa and gradually pushing up into southern Europe, both from Spain and Istanbul. Well, not Istanbul yet; it was still Constantinople. 1500s, 1473, 1453 is Istanbul. So the early Crusades did work, but most of them were abject failures. It did lead to more exploration in the East. And apologies to my online folks, I did just smack the crap out of my mic. I do that a lot. There's Marco Polo, who traveled to China in the 1270s, so this is way before our modern section here. But Marco Polo is important to talk about. He traveled all around and introduced Europe to exotic items and ideas. He's the reason why Europe was so obsessed with China and led to literally centuries of European policy for many, many countries. However, while it certainly was good for, say, Britain, because they got their tea from China, and, silk and all of that good stuff, and various spices, because Europe's known for their bland food, it wasn't always great. In the 1340s, the bubonic plague, or as it's often known, the Black Death, was brought back by Italian ships coming from the east, and wiped out about half of the population over the course of 4 years. This was also the same time that France and England were fighting the 100 Years' War, so it was a real bad time in Europe. Europe got really close to just ending human civilization, at least, again, in Europe. It was bad times. Gradually, though, the plague did ease off because the bubonic plague is a bacterial infection. And once you get it, if you survive, you're immune now because your body knows how to fight it. It's not like a virus where it mutates every freaking 6 months. Once you get it, and if you survive, you're good to go. So gradually, Europeans were able to overcome it. Economies and culture started to come back. We have the Renaissance, which is, of course, known for its art, but also had technological changes. Governments got stronger. Spain and Portugal especially started sending out explorers because while, of course, we think of North America and exploration with, like, England because, you know, we're American and we're very American-centric, but, like, it was Spain and Portugal for a good 200 years. Just Spain and Portugal. The Netherlands a little bit. England didn't get involved until way later. So they would send out explorers and missionaries to find new riches and also converts if they could get around to it. So here we have the Crusades. You've got Saladin there on the left. Usually they have Richard the Lionheart in there somewhere, although the two of them never actually met in battle. I love medieval horses. They're so goofy. Like, do you know what a horse looks like? Oh, yeah, I know what a horse looks like. This is not going to be the worst horse we're going to see today. Speaking of medieval art, I love perspective in medieval art because it didn't exist. You've got this city back here. You've got, this is essentially the Holy Roman Empire, which was centered in Austria, hence the double-headed eagle, which wasn't their symbol at the time, but don't worry about that. This is France. This then would be England. Yeah, because it's got the lion. That was England's old symbol. And you've got these little people inside the city walls. You've got the people back here, you know, near the viewer, so they will be larger. That makes sense. But why are the people over here as tall as the city walls? Don't worry about it, I guess. Medieval art is so much fun. Anyway, there's the Crusades. Again, only the first one actually did anything in terms of taking land from the Muslims there, and then they immediately took it back, and none of the other Crusades did anything. I'm trying to remember which Crusade actually was it. The Fourth Crusade? Let me see. One of the Crusades just like pillaged Constantinople and nothing else. Yeah, Fourth Crusade, that was it. They went to Constantinople. The emperor there promised to give them all this money if they helped him overthrow the throne. They did. He didn't pay them, so they killed him and burned the city down. You know, the city that they were supposed to be there to protect. So yeah, the Crusades were a lot of fun. Anyway, there's Marco Polo, in case you ever wondered what he looked like. And while a lot of his tales of his travels were definitely fabricated, like, you know, if you were to actually read his journals about his travels, like he talked about how, like, you know, the Chinese breathed fire and had literal actual dragons and, you know, all this other stuff. But he did do a lot of traveling. I mean, that's a hell of a lot for someone in the 1200s. Really impressive. So here we have, yeah, this is the spread of the Black Plague, again, starting in Italy, because that's where the ships came in, and then spread up. Um, this region was relatively unaffected due to this is where the Jews were allowed to live in Western uh, Western Russia. There's two reasons why they were largely unaffected. One, apparently, earlier in that time period, the Pope decided that cats were evil and told all his people to just like wipe out the cats in the area. Obviously, the Jews were not under the authority of the Pope, so there were cats in the region. And also, like there's how do I put this? People in the Middle Ages were dirty, but there's like religious ceremonial washing when it comes to like Judaism. So the Jews tended to be a bit cleaner than most of the rest of Europe. So they weren't covered in fleas and rats like the rest of Europe were. So they didn't die in nearly as high numbers as the rest of Europe, which unfortunately made the rest of Europe believe that, oh, then the Jews must be the ones that did it, so then they murdered a bunch of Jews. So, you don't die from the plague, you just get murdered by a bunch of crazies. There was apparently a region in, doesn't really show it on the map here, there was a region in Italy that got away from the plague pretty well. Because they had a policy that if anyone in your family showed symptoms of the plague, you would all be locked in your house, and then they burn your house down. And it worked. The plague didn't spread. Yeah. So yeah, lots of dead bodies. Again, like a third to half the population. Like there weren't enough people left to bury the bodies. And like even if you survived, you would be extremely weak from going through the disease. It was rough. Do I have images of the buboes? I do not. Lucky you guys, because it's rough looking. Here's the 100 Years' War. Obviously, an accurate image of the bowmen at close range. Although longbows did play a big part in the 100 Years' War, but that's a different class. Anyway, Renaissance. This is, I don't remember the name of the chapel. Oh, it's been so long since I've actually done Renaissance stuff. But this is a chapel in Florence, Italy, that was the first chapel or the first structure in almost 1,000 years that had a dome. They had literally lost the technology to build a dome over the course of the Middle Ages. The previous structure to have a dome was Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, which was built around like 500 CE. So yeah, it had been almost 1,000 years. All right. Anyway, let's talk about Portugal. So Italy was basically in control of the Mediterranean, and North Africa was under control of the Muslims. So Portugal had to figure out a different way to go east, because they wanted to get to India. They wanted to get involved in the trade through India, but the two normal routes there were cut off. And especially after 1453, when Constantinople fell and became Istanbul, most of Europe was cut off. So, Portugal's like, all right, well, we've got the whole Atlantic, but as far as we're aware, it just goes. Now, we'll get to Columbus a little bit later, but the tale of everyone thought the world was flat, and if you kept going, you would fall off the edge. And Columbus is like, no, the world is actually round. That was bullshit. People have known since like 500 BCE that the world was round. The Greeks figured it out. we've known forever. You've only got weirdos online today that think the world's flat. Um, the the only difference was that Columbus thought the world was a lot smaller than it was. So he was actually wrong. He just got lucky. But we'll get to that later. The idea to sail west to get to the east was theoretically possible, but they believed that it was just one massive ocean and you would just freaking die out there. Which, if it was just one massive ocean, you would just die out there. If the Atlantic and the Pacific were just one ocean, yeah, you wouldn't make it in a sailing ship. Are you kidding? So, in charge of Portugal was Henry the Navigator. Or, sorry, just Prince Henry, also known as Henry the Navigator, because he put, like, all of his effort into Portugal's overseas expansion. He hired, knowledge from the Arabic world, hired Italian cartographers, because apparently, as we're going to see going forward, Italy's the place to get people to know about sailing and map making. Like, every explorer for the next 200 years is Italian, even if Italy themselves aren't the ones sending them out. Cartographers, navigators that work with the Portuguese to find a route to India through the Atlantic. So how are we going to do that? Let's see. Well, Portugal developed a new type of ship known as the caravel. Had these narrow hulls and triangular sails. Because, again, up until this point, the only sea that most ships ever really traveled was the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean is pretty calm. Like, obviously, you have, the Odyssey with Odysseus and his dumbass getting lost in the Mediterranean for freaking 10 years, which is like getting lost in the parking lot for 12 hours. I mean, come on, dude. But that was, that ship was like half the size of this room. Those were small ships. To get down the west coast of Africa, which, if you don't know, is where hurricanes start, they needed a new type of ship. So they developed the caravel, which is more similar to what you think of when you think of like a big wooden sailing ship. Not entirely the same, but closer to that than, again, like the ship of Odysseus. So, Portugal had established a trading post and a fort on the Gold Coast, which is modern-day Ghana, so they made their way a little ways down the west coast of Africa. Bartolomeo Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope because, and they named it as such because, hey, Africa actually has a southern end. We weren't sure. We weren't sure if it just kept going and, just like connected at the other end. So good for them. We can actually get around. But Diaz was not supplied to keep going. So he got there, proved that you could do it, and then went home. So 10 years later, in 1497, Vasco da Gama followed this route and then kept going and returned to Portugal in 1499 with exotic and expensive spices, thus proving definitively that you could make it to India and make a lot of money in the process. So it was da Gama that finally made this whole enterprise worth it. And this is, again, this being, 500 years ago now, this is the route people had to take when the Suez Canal was blocked. You recall that from a few years ago. Because that's the reason the Suez Canal exists, so you don't have to do this anymore. But when that got blocked, you couldn't do anything. You had to go around. And even today, with modern ships, going around the southern tip of Africa is a bit of a pain, not just from distance, but the waters are rough. Also, for these guys back then, um, there's always the danger of like rocks and shallow shoals and whatnot. And great white sharks live off the coast of South Africa, by the way. So you don't want to deal with that. Anyway, here is Prince Henry the Navigator. This is the start of what we're going to see a lot of when it comes to portraits and statues, etc., of famous people. Is a lot of symbolism. Now, I could, if I was more into like this part of history, I could point at everything on this and tell you about it. But obviously, the big clear thing here is he's holding a map because he was the navigator. He was the guy that was pushing Portugal into their expansion phase. So there's that. Let's see what else we have. Oh, here is a rendition or a rendering of the caravel. Again, not identical to like a frigate or a man of war, a ship with a line, etc., that you would see like, you know, in the like later British Empire. But this is the early concept. That's a caravel. It was really good at catching wind. It was very sturdy, which was very important. Here we have, let's see, this should be Diaz. Again, you've got, I think that's a sextant there that he's holding. It's just another, or maybe astrolabe. I can never keep the nautical equipment straight, but that's used for navigation. He's also got a sword there on his side, which could imply not only, you know, martial prowess, but that he has some level of nobility, because nobles were the ones who were the warriors back really until like World War I when they all died. Let's see. And then again we have Vasco da Gama, same thing. You've got a map here, and if that was too subtle for you, he's on a freaking ship. He's doing the exploring in the painting. Again, he's got a sword, he's got armor, and actually even on the ship sails, they've got the cross, so it's not just he's got the power of the army behind him, he's got nobility, and also like even his little necklace there, but like the church is behind him because Portugal was a very Catholic nation as well. So he's got basically all of Portugal behind him in what he's doing. All right. So let's see. We've got, this voyage is sponsored by Henry the Navigator, which got down to the Gold Coast where they set up a fort. And like these were important for these later voyages where they could go down and like resupply, because like obviously you couldn't just get water off the side of the boat. You can't drink salt water, you will die. So they had to stop and like get fresh water and food and whatnot at these various posts. Diaz made its way down the coast and then got here and realized, okay, good, we can keep going. I'm going home. Da Gama, I don't know what this is about. He damn near discovered South America, and then made his way up to India. All right. So this was, let's see. Yeah, so Da Gama had returned by 1499. By the early 1500s, Portugal had pretty much taken control of Indian trade. They were on the ball. Because again, the Muslim forces, the Arabian fleets were there, but they were like short-range ships. They weren't very large, they weren't very powerful, they weren't expecting these big-ass caravels to just suddenly sail from out of nowhere. And And they not only sailed to India, but they kept going all the way to Indonesia, China, and Japan. And so for several decades, Portugal was the top nation in the world, which again is weird to say because, like, what do we know about Portugal today? Not much of anything. Honestly, the only other time we're going to talk about Portugal is for Brazil. That's why Brazil speaks Portuguese, but we'll get to that later. So yeah, but for a while, Portugal was the top explorer in the world. So the other European powers began scrambling to catch up because not only was Portugal trading all over the world, but they were making crazy amounts of money. And if they're making money, they're able to put money into their military, and suddenly that becomes very scary for everybody else. Because this little power on the end of the Iberian Peninsula, which is to say, where Spain is getting really, really powerful. So yeah, they can expand their means to tax, their means to wage war. Their ships are becoming more powerful, which is the easiest way to express their sphere of influence. However, as they further expanded their economic power, they needed a new force to run this economy. Because if they're creating these outposts in Africa and India and various points in Asia, Portugal doesn't have that many people. Like they're a relatively populous nation, but they're not like bursting at the seams with people that need to go overseas and fill these jobs. So they went back to the age-old topic of slavery. Now, slavery's been around forever. Again, I do Western Civ, and like the first civilization we talk about is Mesopotamia, and they had slaves. Like as early as we start, as early as humans have things, they're enslaving each other. Now, granted, that was typically like people taken in battle, people that were sold due to like if some guy killed another guy, rather than sending him to jail, he was made a slave. Like that person's life is now forfeit, and rather than just putting him in a cell somewhere, he's now a slave for the rest of his life. Or to pay a debt for like a certain period of time. Indentured servitude is a common thing. And even then, slavery wasn't inherited. So even if like this guy kills some guy and he becomes a slave the rest of his life, his kids aren't slaves. So he can still like have a family, but his family aren't slaves. So even like as far back as like Rome, which was notorious for its slavery, it typically wasn't inherited. That's not until later. However, as the Europeans pushed into the African slave trade, that started to change. Now, that doesn't change until a little bit later, but that is where things start to shift. Because, of course. So, of course, have the slave ships, but we'll get more into that a little later. Actually, is that like the next? Let's see. I don't remember exactly where that slide is. So most Europeans were familiar with North Africa, which was influenced by the Muslim forces there. So they were used to like these big kingdoms, and in particular Egypt, and they were tied to the east. So again, like Persia, Arabia, etc. So this was what they were used to when they thought about Africa. It was Northern Africa. However, as they started pushing further south into West Africa, because again, Europeans could not push into the heart of Africa because they would die of malaria. they started building trade posts and began to purchase slaves from the various tribes living on the West African coast. Because again, the tribes living in Africa also participated in the slave trade, but similar to what I mentioned before, where like if you were captured in battle, rather than be sent to like a prisoner of war camp, you would be enslaved. You would be put to good use, I guess you could say. Or, rather than be just like executed because you were an enemy of the tribe, it's like, well, how about you just work in the fields? So these slaves, they were dirty, tired, exhausted, began to characterize how Europeans viewed Africans. Does the book go into... No, the book doesn't really go into what's the name of the islands? The Canary Islands, which were a group of islands off the western coast of Africa that, I want to say Portugal and Spain, I think those are the two countries, tried to take it over, and the natives there fought back. And so by the time Portugal and Spain took it over, they had wiped out the natives, so they couldn't just enslave them and make them work the plantations that they had built. So that was when they went to Africa and brought slaves over to work the plantations there. And that's kind of where it started. So this was further ingrained in the Europeans' idea of a race, that they were, quote, assigned by God into a life of bondage. There was this Christian belief that Africans were the cursed, quote, sons of Ham, and there was this moral impetus for slavery. So if you're not familiar with the Old Testament, after the flood, the global genocide, Noah got drunk off his ass and fell asleep nude, as one does after surviving a global genocide. And his son Ham walked in and found him passed out on the floor naked. So he goes and tells his brothers, because it's funny. The dude's like 800 years old and he's passed out on the floor wine drunk. So his brothers walk in backwards so they don't see their father's nakedness and cover him with a blanket. And apparently Noah then wakes up and curses Ham and all of his descendants to be bound in servitude because he looked upon his father's nakedness or some shit. So yeah, that was the moral impetus for slavery. And this gets brought up well into the 1800s. FYI. So, and I actually recently was watching a video, and this guy makes this argument. It's like, oh, well, it was Americans' Christian ideals that caused us to abolish slavery. And I laughed so hard it woke up my cat. Like, really? It was the Christian beliefs that had people fighting for slavery. Don't bullshit. Like, the Quakers were fighting against it, sure. There were Christian groups who were fighting against it. But, like, the people who were fighting for it the most were using Christian beliefs. So, like, don't pull that shit. Anyway, Africa had a lot of diverse and varied cultures, highly civilized kingdoms and societies, many of which did actually convert to Christianity. And you had these kingdoms beg the Portuguese to stop taking their people and putting them into slavery because, hey, we're all Christians too. And you're not supposed to enslave your own people, right? Because, again, if you go back to the Old Testament, God's totally cool with slavery, except for, like, within the Jews, like, within their own people. Like, okay, you can't enslave another Hebrew, but the other people, it's fine. So, moving that into Christianity, it's like, okay, well, we're enslaving other people, I guess, but, like, you can't enslave other Christians, right? Well, I guess it didn't really matter because Europeans, man. Still, though, this was before perpetual slavery became a thing. For the most part, Africans were largely just put alongside other bound labor, which is to say, like indentured servants, peasants, criminals, apprentices, etc. Slavic workers were especially common on these sugar plantations, which is where we actually get the term slave, and again, Slavics being like Eastern Europeans. So, while of course this was bad, I'm not going to be like, oh, well, see, slavery wasn't so bad. It definitely gets worse. It wasn't as bad as it gets at the start. This was a relatively temporary thing, even though it was happening in such large numbers that it was literally destroying kingdoms. So, right, before I let you guys go, because we are getting towards the end of time, when I mentioned the weird horse images, I've got some real weird images here of how the Europeans viewed Africans, and yeah, this is technically racist, but also it's so weird, it kind of loops around. So, I don't have anything else. I'm just going to, here you go. I don't know, man. I don't know why their face is in their chest. I don't know what's going on. I don't know. I don't know. And I don't know why there's like an armadillo back here and like a lion looking like they're about to have a fight. I don't know what's happening in this image. But this wasn't the only one. Like this happened. Okay, this was like a stage show in London. London was freaking weird. But like this was relatively normal. This happened a lot in these old paintings. Also, this is the really weird horse I was talking about. It's a unicorn for some reason, and it's really fat. But yeah, this was how they were depicted early on. I don't know. I wish this was how Bigfoot was depicted. I wish this was how we depicted Bigfoot. Not just like, oh, he's an ape. Like, no, he's got a head in the middle of his chest. That would be the best cryptid. I think that's it. Yeah, we'll talk about Crossing the Atlantic next Tuesday. I'll see y'all then. Sorry about the cursed images.